There is a pattern hidden in history. Not a theory, not a coincidence, a pattern. It has repeated itself across centuries, across continents, across civilizations that once believed they were invincible. Empires that built monuments touching the sky, commanded armies that shook the earth, and ruled over millions who believed their dominance would last forever. Every single one of them fell, not slowly, not always predictably, but inevitably. And the most unsettling part is this: they all collapsed in almost the exact same way, not because of enemies alone, not because of war alone, but because of something far more dangerous, something that grows quietly, invisibly, inside the system itself, a flaw, a weakness, a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because it doesn't just belong to ancient empires. It exists today, in nations, in systems, even in people. And history has already shown us how it ends. So the real question is not whether collapse happens. The real question is, can it ever be stopped? Or is every empire simply delaying the inevitable? To understand this pattern, we need to go back, not to a single empire, but to the beginning of power itself, because every empire, no matter how different it seems, begins the same way, with a rise that feels unstoppable, a moment where everything aligns, and a belief begins to take hold. This will last forever, and that belief is where the pattern begins. At first, an empire is not an empire. It is an idea, a fragile, uncertain force built by people who are driven, hungry, and often desperate. They are not powerful yet. They are disciplined, focused, united by a shared struggle. Every decision matters. Every resource is scarce. Every victory feels earned. And because of that, they evolve. They adapt faster than their enemies. They think sharper. They move with purpose. This is the phase where empires are at their strongest, even though they appear weak, because hunger creates clarity, and clarity creates power. But something begins to change the moment success arrives. Not immediately, not visibly, but slowly. Success starts to rewrite behavior. The same discipline that built the empire begins to fade. The same hunger that once drove innovation begins to soften, because when survival is no longer a question, comfort begins to take its place, and comfort is where the pattern quietly grows. At this stage, nothing looks wrong. From the outside, the empire appears stronger than ever. Its borders expand, its wealth increases, its influence spreads. People admire it, fear it, depend on it. And this is exactly why the danger is so hard to detect, because the empire is not collapsing yet. It is peaking, and peaks are deceptive. They create the illusion of permanence. They convince leaders and people that the system is too big to fail, too powerful to break, too established to fall. But history has already answered that belief, over and over again. Because the fall does not begin when enemies attack. It begins much earlier, in silence, in subtle shifts, in decisions that seem harmless, even logical, in the moment. And by the time the cracks become visible, the collapse is already in motion. So what exactly is this pattern? What is the invisible force that turns strength into weakness, growth into decay, and power into collapse? To see it clearly, we need to examine what happens next. Because after every rise comes a phase that looks like stability, but is actually the beginning of decline, and almost no one notices it while it's happening. In the next part, we'll uncover the first major shift, the moment when strength quietly transforms into vulnerability, and why this stage is the most dangerous of all. Because it doesn't feel like failure. It feels like success. There is a moment in every empire's life when everything appears to be working perfectly. The systems are stable, the economy is strong, the people feel secure. From the outside, it looks like success has finally been mastered. But this moment is not the peak of strength. It is the beginning of blindness. Because stability creates a very specific kind of illusion. It convinces those in power that the systems they've built are no longer fragile, but permanent. And once that belief takes hold, something subtle begins to shift. Leaders stop questioning what once required constant attention. Structures that were carefully maintained are now simply assumed to work. And the mindset changes from, "We must stay sharp to survive," to, "We have already figured it out." This is where awareness begins to fade. Not because people become unintelligent, but because they become comfortable. And comfort removes urgency. Without urgency, there is no pressure to adapt. Without adaptation, there is no preparation for what comes next. At this stage, the empire still functions. In fact, it often functions better than ever before. Trade flows smoothly. Cities grow. Institutions expand. And for the average person, life feels stable, predictable, even safe. But beneath that surface, something important has already started to decay. The connection between cause and consequence weakens. Decisions are no longer made with survival in mind, but with preservation of comfort. Short-term stability becomes more important than long-term resilience. And this shift is almost invisible because the results don't appear immediately. They accumulate slowly, quietly, over years, sometimes decades. Think about it. When an empire is struggling, every mistake is obvious, every weakness is exposed. But when an empire is thriving, mistakes can hide. Weaknesses can grow unnoticed. Because success covers them, it delays the consequences. And that delay is what makes the pattern so dangerous. Over time, systems become more complex, layers of control are added, bureaucracies expand, rules multiply. Not always out of necessity, but out of habit, out of the desire to maintain order, without questioning whether the system still needs to evolve. And complexity creates distance. Distance between leaders and reality. Distance between decisions and their true impact. This is when the empire starts losing something it once had. Clarity. The ability to see problems early and respond with precision. Now, problems don't disappear, they just take longer to be recognized, and by the time they are no longer small. But here's what makes this phase truly dangerous. It feels like success. There are no alarms, no sudden collapse, no visible crisis, just a slow shift in mindset. A quiet drift away from the principles that once made the empire strong. And because nothing seems wrong, nothing is corrected. Because nothing is corrected, the pattern continues. History shows this again and again. Empires don't fall at their weakest point. They fall after they've convinced themselves they are at their strongest. Because strength creates overconfidence, and overconfidence removes the very behaviors that created strength in the first place. At this stage, the empire still has power, still has influence, still has resources, but it has started to lose something far more important: its ability to respond, its ability to adapt, its ability to see clearly. And once that ability is weakened, the next phase becomes inevitable, because when clarity disappears, something else takes its place. Something far more dangerous than weakness. Corruption. Not always in the obvious sense, not always illegal, but psychological. Systemic, a slow shift where decisions are no longer made for the survival of the empire, but for the benefit of individuals within it. And this is where the pattern accelerates. In the next part, we'll uncover how corruption quietly spreads through a system, why it feels normal while it's happening, and how it transforms strength into something fragile. Because by the time corruption becomes visible, the collapse is no longer a possibility. It's a countdown. Corruption rarely begins as something obvious. It doesn't arrive as chaos. It doesn't announce itself as destruction. In fact, it often looks like normal behavior. Reasonable decisions. Practical choices. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because by the time people recognize it, it already feels familiar. In the early stages, the system still appears functional. Leaders still speak of stability. Institutions still operate. Rules still exist. But something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface. The purpose of the system is no longer aligned with its original goal. At the beginning of every empire, systems are built for survival. Every decision is made with the future in mind. There is a clear connection between effort and reward, between responsibility and consequence. But as stability turns into comfort, and comfort turns into expectation, that connection begins to weaken. Now, decisions are no longer about what strengthens the empire. They are about what maintains position, protects status, preserves control. And this shift is almost invisible at first because it doesn't break the system immediately. It bends it. Slowly. Quietly. Positions of power start attracting different kinds of people. Not those who are most capable, but those who are most strategic in navigating the system. Those who understand how to benefit from it, rather than improve it. And over time, this changes everything because the system begins to select for self-interest instead of competence. Rules are no longer enforced equally, not always because of malice, but because enforcement becomes selective, flexible, dependent on influence. And once that happens, trust begins to erode, not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. People begin to notice small inconsistencies, small unfairnesses, moments where the system doesn't behave the way it should. At first they ignore it, because the system still works most of the time. But over time, those small moments accumulate, and they begin to form a pattern of their own. A realization begins to spread. The system is no longer fair. And once people stop believing in fairness, their behavior changes. Loyalty weakens, not because people become disloyal, but because the system no longer earns their loyalty. Effort decreases, not because people become lazy, but because effort is no longer reliably rewarded. And this is where corruption becomes self-sustaining, because it doesn't need to be enforced anymore. It spreads through behavior, through adaptation, through people adjusting to a system that no longer functions as it once did. At this stage, the empire is still powerful. From the outside, it may even appear stronger than ever, but internally, it has begun to hollow out. Resources are still there, structures are still standing, but the foundation, the trust, the alignment between individuals and the system is weakening. And here's the most dangerous part. Those in power often don't see it, or if they do, they underestimate it, because corruption doesn't feel like collapse. It feels manageable. It feels controllable. It feels like something that can be fixed later. But history shows something different. By the time corruption becomes visible, it has already reshaped the system. It has already altered incentives. It has already changed behavior at every level. And systems don't collapse because of one major failure. They collapse because thousands of small failures go uncorrected. At this point, the empire has entered a new phase, one where strength still exists, but is no longer reliable, one where power still appears stable, but is becoming increasingly fragile. And fragility has a unique property. It doesn't reveal itself gradually. It reveals itself suddenly, under pressure. Because once a system is weakened from within, it doesn't need a massive force to break it. It only needs the right moment, the right stress, the right trigger, and that trigger always comes. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when pressure begins to build, how external threats expose internal weakness, and why empires often miscalculate their own strength in this phase. Because this is where the illusion finally starts to crack. And once it does, there's no going back. Every weakened system eventually faces a moment of pressure. It's unavoidable. Because no empire exists in isolation. There are always external forces, rising competitors, shifting environments, unexpected crises. And under normal conditions, a strong system adapts. It absorbs the pressure. It adjusts, recalibrates, survives. But a system that has been quietly weakened from within responds very differently. Because the problem is no longer the pressure itself. The problem is how the system reacts to it. At first, the response appears confident. Leaders reassure. Institutions double down. Decisions are made quickly, sometimes aggressively, because on the surface the empire still believes in its own strength. But this is where miscalculation begins. Because the perception of strength is no longer aligned with reality. Remember, the system has already lost clarity. It has already been shaped by corruption. It has already weakened its own foundation. But none of that is fully visible yet. So when pressure arrives, the empire responds as if it is still operating at full strength. And that mismatch creates the first real cracks. Resources are allocated inefficiently. Problems are misdiagnosed. Solutions are applied to symptoms instead of causes. And because the system is more complex now, more layered, more distant from reality, feedback becomes distorted. Leaders are not seeing what is actually happening. They are seeing filtered versions of it, delayed versions of it, sometimes even manipulated versions of it. And this delay is critical because in moments of pressure, timing matters. A small delay can turn a manageable problem into an irreversible one. At the same time, the internal weaknesses begin to surface, not all at once, but in fragments. A failure here, a breakdown there, a decision that doesn't produce the expected outcome. Individually, these events don't seem catastrophic, but together, they begin to form a pattern of instability. And this is when uncertainty begins to spread, not just among the people, but within the system itself. Institutions start losing confidence in each other. Coordination weakens. Decisions become inconsistent, sometimes even contradictory. And as this happens, something very important begins to shift. The perception of control. For a long time, the empire appeared in control of everything. But now, control starts to feel uncertain, not lost, but fragile. And people sense this, even if they can't explain it, even if it's not openly discussed. They feel the hesitation, the inconsistency, the subtle signs that something isn't as stable as it once was. And once perception changes, behavior follows. Confidence begins to decline. Trust weakens further. And reactions become more emotional, more defensive, more short-term. This is where the system starts making its most critical mistakes, because instead of addressing the root causes, it tries to regain control quickly, through force, through stricter rules, through decisions that prioritize immediate stability over long-term survival. And while these actions may work temporarily, they come at a cost. Because they increase pressure internally, they strain the system further. They accelerate the very weaknesses they are trying to contain. This creates a cycle. Pressure leads to reaction. Reaction increases internal strain. Strain reduces the system's ability to respond effectively, and reduced effectiveness invites more pressure. A loop. And like all loops, it becomes harder to break over time. At this stage, the empire is no longer stable. But it hasn't collapsed yet. It exists in a state of tension, a fragile balance between control and chaos. And this is the phase where outcomes become unpredictable. Because the system can still recover, but only if it recognizes what is happening. Only if it regains clarity. Only if it corrects its course. But history shows this almost never happens, because by the time pressure reveals the truth, the system is already too entangled, too reactive, too disconnected from reality. And so, instead of adapting, it escalates. And escalation leads to the next phase. A phase where the cracks are no longer subtle, where instability becomes visible, where events start unfolding faster, and control begins to slip. In the next part, we'll explore the breaking point, the moment when pressure turns into crisis, and why, at this stage, even small events can trigger massive consequences. Because once the system reaches this point, collapse is no longer a distant possibility. It becomes imminent. There is always a moment when the pressure becomes too much, not gradually, not evenly, but suddenly. It doesn't always look dramatic at first. Sometimes it begins with something small, a decision that fails, a conflict that escalates, an event that, under normal circumstances, would have been contained. But this is no longer a normal system, because by this stage, the empire is already fragile, the foundation has already weakened, the responses are already distorted. So when the moment comes, the system doesn't absorb the shock, it amplifies it. A single failure triggers another, and then another. Not because each one is catastrophic on its own, but because the system can no longer stabilize itself. This is the breaking point, where small cracks connect and become fractures, where isolated problems merge and form a crisis. And what makes this phase so dangerous is the speed. For a long time, decline felt slow, almost unnoticeable, but collapse feels fast, unpredictable, overwhelming, because once the system loses its ability to regulate itself, events begin to accelerate. Decisions are made under pressure, often without full understanding, often without coordination, and these decisions, instead of solving problems, create new ones. At the same time, trust, which was already weakening, begins to break more openly. People stop believing in the system's ability to protect them. Institutions stop relying on each other. Leaders start prioritizing control over stability. And this changes the behavior of everyone involved. Some try to hold the system together. Some try to protect their own position. Some begin to withdraw completely. And as these behaviors spread, cohesion disappears. The system is no longer functioning as a unified structure. It becomes fragmented, unpredictable, difficult to control. And here's the critical shift. The empire is no longer reacting to prevent collapse. It is reacting to survive collapse. The goal changes, not always consciously, but inevitably. Because deep down, the system recognizes something it has been avoiding. It can no longer return to what it was. And this realization creates instability at every level. Attempts to regain control become more extreme, more desperate, stronger enforcement, harsher decisions, faster reactions. But these actions don't restore stability. They expose weakness, because control without trust does not create order. It creates resistance, and resistance increases pressure even further. This is where the system begins to turn against itself, not in a single moment, but through a series of reactions that accelerate decline. And from the outside, this phase often looks confusing, chaotic, difficult to understand, because there is no single cause, no single failure, just a system that has lost its balance, trying to correct itself too late. And this is why collapse often feels sudden, even though it has been building for a long time, because the breaking point is not the beginning of the fall, it is the moment the fall becomes visible. At this stage, there is still movement, still action, still attempts to stabilize, but the direction has already changed. The system is no longer moving toward recovery. It is moving toward resolution, and resolution does not mean survival. In the next part, we'll explore what happens after the breaking point, why collapse spreads faster than expected, how systems lose control completely, and what the final stage of every fallen empire actually looks like. Because once the breaking point is crossed, there is no longer a question of if, only a question of how fast. After the breaking point, there is a brief moment where everything still appears recoverable. Structures are still standing, leaders are still in place, systems are still operating, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, control has already begun to slip. Because collapse is not a single event, it is a process. A rapid unraveling of everything that once held the system together. At first, the signs are uneven. Some parts of the empire continue to function. Others begin to fail. This creates confusion. Because the system doesn't collapse all at once, it fractures. And these fractures spread. Not randomly, but along the lines where weakness has already formed. Institutions that once coordinated seamlessly begin to act independently. Decisions that were once unified become fragmented. Communication breaks down, not completely, but enough to create delays, contradictions, misunderstandings. And in a system already under pressure, these small disruptions become critical. Because coordination is what holds complexity together. And once coordination weakens, complex systems begin to fail. At the same time, trust continues to erode. But now it becomes visible. People no longer assume stability. They question it. They begin to prepare, not for recovery, but for uncertainty. And the shift in mindset accelerates everything. Because systems rely not just on structure, but on belief. Belief that rules will be followed. Belief that decisions will be enforced. Belief that the system will continue to function tomorrow, the way it functions today. And once that belief weakens, behavior changes rapidly. Compliance decreases, cooperation declines. Individuals begin to act in their own interest, because they no longer trust the system to act in theirs. And this creates a feedback loop. As more people withdraw trust, the system becomes weaker. As the system becomes weaker, more people withdraw trust, and the cycle accelerates. At this stage, attempts to regain control become increasingly ineffective, not because effort is lacking, but because the foundation required for control is no longer there. Rules without trust are ignored. Authority without legitimacy is challenged. Decisions without coordination create more instability. And so, control becomes reactive, fragmented, short-lived. Moments of order appear, but they don't last, because the system can no longer sustain them. From the outside, this phase often looks chaotic, but internally, it follows a pattern of systems losing alignment, losing coordination, losing cohesion, until eventually, they lose control entirely. And when that happens, the collapse becomes undeniable. Structures that once seemed permanent are no longer reliable. Power that once seemed absolute is no longer effective, and the empire, as it once existed, ceases to function, not necessarily in a single moment, but in a way that cannot be reversed. And this is the point where something important becomes clear. Collapse is not just the failure of systems, it is the failure of alignment between people, between institutions, between purpose and behavior. And once that alignment is gone, rebuilding is no longer about repair. It requires transformation. In the next part, we'll explore what comes after collapse, why new systems eventually emerge from the ruins, why the pattern begins again, and what this cycle reveals about human nature itself. Because the end of one empire has never been the end of the pattern. It has always been the beginning of another. After the collapse, there is silence, not immediate chaos, not constant destruction, but a quiet, unsettling absence of what once existed. The systems that once organized life are no longer there. The structures that once created order no longer function the same way. And for a moment, everything feels uncertain, because people are no longer reacting to a system, they are reacting to its absence. This is the phase that is often misunderstood, because from the outside, collapse looks like an ending. But in reality, it is a transition, because once the old system breaks, something else begins to form. Not immediately, not intentionally, but inevitably. Humans do not exist comfortably in disorder. They seek structure, they rebuild patterns, they create new systems, even from the fragments of the old ones. And this is where the cycle begins again. At first, these new systems look very different. They are simpler, more direct, less complex, because complexity was part of what failed before. There is a return to clarity, a return to basic principles, survival, coordination, trust, the same elements that existed at the beginning of every empire. And for a time, these systems are strong, not because they are large, but because they are aligned. People understand them, they believe in them, they participate in them, and this alignment creates stability. But if you look closely, you'll notice something familiar. The same conditions that existed at the start of previous empires are forming again. Discipline, focus, shared purpose. And from these conditions, growth begins. Slowly at first, then faster. Structures expand, influence increases, complexity returns. And over time, the new system begins to resemble the old one. Not exactly the same, but shaped by the same forces. And this is the part of the pattern that is hardest to accept. Collapse does not prevent repetition. It resets it, because the pattern is not just about systems, it is about behavior, human behavior. The same tendencies that led to the rise of one empire exist in the next. The same shifts that turn strength into weakness begin to appear again. Comfort replaces urgency. Stability replaces awareness. Complexity replaces clarity. And slowly, the cycle moves forward. Not because people are unaware of history, but because awareness alone is not enough. Because the pattern operates beneath intention, beneath knowledge, beneath even logic. It is driven by how humans respond to power, to comfort, to control, and these responses are remarkably consistent. This is why history repeats itself, not in exact events, not in identical timelines, but in patterns. And once you begin to see these patterns, something changes, because history is no longer just a record of the past. It becomes a mirror, a way to understand the present, a way to recognize the early signs before they become visible to everyone else. And this is where the real question begins to take shape. If the pattern is driven by human behavior, and human behavior remains consistent, then is the cycle unavoidable, or is it possible to break it? In the final part, we'll explore that question, not as a theory, but as a challenge, because understanding the pattern is only the first step. What you do with that understanding is what determines whether the cycle continues or changes. Every cycle in history eventually leads to a question, not about what happened, but why it keeps happening. If every empire rises through discipline and falls through the loss of it, then the real question is not about the past. It is about the present. Because the pattern is not locked in history. It is active. It exists wherever systems grow, wherever power accumulates, wherever comfort replaces urgency. And that means it is not something that only happened once, or twice, or in ancient civilizations. It is something that continues to emerge in different forms, in different places, at different scales, but always following the same structure. Rise, stability, expansion, complexity, comfort, blindness, pressure, break, collapse, reset, and then again. But if the pattern is consistent, then so is the question that follows it. Can it be broken? The answer is not simple. Because breaking a pattern like this does not require awareness alone. It requires resistance against forces that feel natural, comfortable, even necessary. It requires the ability to remain aware, even when things feel stable, to question systems, even when they are working, to recognize early signs of imbalance, even when they are small enough to ignore. Because the most dangerous stage of any system is not collapse, it is success. Success creates confidence. Confidence creates assumption. Assumption creates blindness, and blindness creates repetition. So breaking the pattern is not about avoiding collapse. It is about avoiding the conditions that make collapse inevitable. But history shows how difficult this is, because every generation believes it is different, more informed, more advanced, less likely to repeat the same mistakes. And yet, the structure remains the same, because the forces that shape this pattern are not external. They are internal. They exist in how people respond to comfort, to power, to stability, to success. And unless those responses change, the pattern continues. Not because people are unaware, but because awareness alone is not enough to override behavior. So the question is not just whether the pattern can be understood. It clearly can. The question is whether it can be interrupted, before comfort becomes blindness, before stability becomes illusion, before strength becomes fragility. And that question does not belong to history. It belongs to now. Because every system that exists today is somewhere inside the same cycle. Some are at the beginning, some are at the peak, some are already in decline, but all of them follow the same structure. And that means the pattern is not something we only observe, it is something we participate in. So when you look at history, you are not just looking at what happened, you are looking at what always happens. And the final realization is this: empires do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they forget what made them strong. And if that forgetting is part of the pattern, then remembering might be the only resistance. Not perfect resistance, not guaranteed resistance, but awareness that interrupts automation. Because the moment a system believes it no longer needs to question itself, the pattern begins again. And so the cycle continues. Not because it must, but because it has not been interrupted yet. And that is where history leaves us. Not with an ending, but with a choice to observe the pattern or to become part of it. Because the difference between the two is never visible in the moment, only in hindsight. And by then, the pattern has already moved on.